He dropped it while he was running. A small thing, a service-issue gas mask case with a number stenciled on the inside, and in almost any other circumstance it would have meant nothing, just a piece of kit lost in the dark. But this was February 1942 in London, and that number led directly to a name, and that name led directly to a man, and that man had killed 4 women in 6 days, while the city around him was already burning. Gordon Cummins was 28 years old, an RAF cadet, charming, well-presented, the kind of man his fellow servicemen called the Duke because of the way he performed a refinement he had largely invented for himself, and none of that made him seem like what he was, which is perhaps the most important thing to understand before anything else about this story, because the terror of it was never really about the darkness of the blackout. It was about the man who knew exactly how to use it. London in the winter of 1942 was a city that had learned to live with fear as a background condition, and the blackout was the most visible expression of that. Every night, from dusk to dawn, the streetlights went off, the curtains went heavy, the shop fronts went black, and millions of people simply disappeared into the darkness and tried to survive until morning, which by that point in the war most of them had become remarkably good at doing. What the blackout created, though, beyond the obvious practical inconvenience, was a city of almost total anonymity after dark, where the usual social visibility that might protect someone, being seen, being noticed, being placed in a context, ceased to exist, and women were moving through that darkness in greater numbers than ever before, because the war had put them in factories, in offices, on late shifts, traveling alone in a way that pre-war London would barely have recognized. The social world of wartime London had also loosened considerably in ways that created their own particular vulnerabilities, because the pubs and bars of the West End were full every night of servicemen on leave and women working close to the city, and the general atmosphere of transience, everyone passing through, everyone a stranger, meant that striking up a conversation with someone you had never met was not just acceptable but normal. And Cummins understood that in a way that most people around him simply did not think to question. He had constructed his social identity with real care. The hinted at aristocratic connections, the polished manner, the nickname that his billet mates gave him with what they imagined was gentle mockery. And that constructed self was the instrument he used, because a man who seems like he belongs somewhere is a man no one looks at twice, and in a city already distracted by survival, that was more than enough cover for what he was planning to do. The 9th of February 1942 was a Monday, and Cummins was on leave, and Evelyn Hamilton, a 40-year-old pharmacist, was found strangled in an air raid shelter in Marylebone, her handbag taken and her body arranged with a deliberateness that spoke not to rage or panic but to someone who had taken their time and felt no particular urgency about it. And the detail that stayed with investigators was how controlled the scene was, how little of the disorder you might expect from a violent crime was actually present. The following night, the body of Evelyn Oatley was found in her flat in Wardour Street, and the violence was significantly worse than the first. And what's important here is not just the escalation, but the speed of it, because less than 24 hours separated these two deaths, and Cummins had returned to his billet between them, had slept, had eaten breakfast with his fellow cadets, had moved through the ordinary structures of his day before going out again. Margaret Lowe and Doris Joannet were both found on the 13th of February in different parts of the city, which meant that at some point on the night of the 12th, Cummins had killed twice and crossed London between one murder and the next. And this is the detail that forces you to reckon with something about the psychology here, because this was not a man losing control. This was a man who was, in some deeply unsettling sense, entirely in control, and simply choosing to keep going. There were also 2 women who survived attacks during those same 6 days, and their accounts are significant not just as evidence, but as a corrective to the way true crime tends to frame its subjects, because Greta Haywood and Catherine Mulcahy both escaped because something interrupted Cummins. A passerby in one case, a doorbell in another, and both were able to describe their attacker with a consistency and clarity that would later become central to the case against him. What their survival tells us about Cummins is that his confidence was not absolute and his composure was not unshakable, that he was still at this point constrained by the possibility of being seen and identified, which makes the speed and frequency of the killings all the more striking because it means he understood the risk he was taking and simply assessed it as acceptable, which is a different and in some ways more disturbing thing than a man acting without thinking. The police by this point were beginning to understand the scale of what they were dealing with, and the reference that kept surfacing in internal discussions was the one that any Londoner of a certain generation would recognize immediately: the Ripper. Because the pattern of targeting, the West End geography, and the mutilation in several of the cases all carried an echo that investigators found impossible to ignore, even if they were careful about using that word publicly. Because the last thing a city already at war needed was to be told that Jack had come back. The gas mask case that Cummins dropped while fleeing the attack on Greta Haywood was a standard RAF-issue respirator carrier, and what made it decisive was not any sophisticated forensic quality, but something entirely administrative. His service number was stenciled on the inside in regulation ink, the way all service equipment was marked, and when that number was checked against RAF records, the result came back almost immediately with a name and a unit and a billet address in St. John's Wood, which placed him within easy walking distance of every crime scene. When officers searched his quarters, the evidence assembled itself with a speed that was almost difficult to process, because among his ordinary possessions, his uniform, his personal effects, the unremarkable furniture of a serviceman's billet, were a watch belonging to Evelyn Oatley and a cigarette case belonging to Margaret Lowe, kept not hidden but simply present, stored among his things the way a person might store anything they considered theirs, and the casualness of that is something investigators at the time found deeply disturbing. He was arrested on the 15th of February, 6 days after the first killing, and the case broke so quickly that it is genuinely worth sitting with the counterfactual, because without that dropped gas mask, without that one moment of flight and the one piece of equipment that left his hands in the dark, the investigation could have taken months, and the question of how many more women might have died in that time is one that has no comfortable answer. The psychological question that has followed the Cummins case for decades is not really about motive in the conventional sense, because there is no single grievance or trigger that explains the pattern, but about the architecture of the person, specifically about how someone maintains two such completely separate selves with such apparent ease, because the man his colleagues knew was sociable, aspirational, vain in a harmless way, and there is no account from anyone who knew him that suggests they ever saw anything beneath that surface, which is either a testament to how well he concealed himself or a reminder of how little we are actually capable of seeing in the people around us. Some researchers have pointed to the wartime context as more than incidental, arguing that the blackout and the social disruption of 1942 London gave Cummins not just practical cover, but a kind of psychological permission. A period of generalized violence in which individual violence might, in some distorted internal logic, feel less exposed. And while that reading is speculative, it is not unreasonable, because context does shape behavior in people who are already inclined toward harm, and Cummins was operating in a context that had effectively removed several of the usual constraints. The question of whether he had killed before 1942 has never been definitively resolved, and it probably never will be, but the control and efficiency he demonstrated in those 6 days, the speed, the composure, the ability to return to ordinary life between murders, has led a number of criminologists to suggest that this was not a first experiment, that somewhere in the years before February 1942 there are cases that remain open, names that remain unconnected to his, and that the Blackout Ripper may have had a history that the historical record has simply not been able to reconstruct. He was tried for the murder of Evelyn Oatley alone, convicted in less than a day, and sentenced to death, and he was hanged at Wandsworth Prison on the 25th of June 1942, while an air raid was taking place above the city, which is the kind of detail that history occasionally produces and that fiction would never dare to invent. The blackout ended with the war, and London came slowly back into the light, and the story of Gordon Cummins settled into the category of cases that criminologists and historians return to periodically, cited, analyzed, placed in relation to other cases, used to build models of a type of person that the profession has spent decades trying to understand. And there is something in that process that is useful, and something in it that is also a kind of erasure, because the more a case becomes a case study, the further it moves from what it actually was. What it actually was, in February 1942, was 4 women who had survived the Blitz: Evelyn Hamilton, Evelyn Oatley, Margaret Lowe, Doris Joannet, who had navigated a bombed and darkened city and kept working and kept living, and who died not from a raid or a bomb, but from the deliberate, considered actions of a man they had no particular reason to fear in the specific way they needed to. And that distinction matters because it is the thing that makes the case genuinely disturbing rather than simply historically notable. The darkness lifted eventually, the way darkness always does. But for 6 nights in February 1942, it belonged entirely to Gordon Cummins, and 4 women paid for that with everything they had. And a dropped gas mask in a blacked-out street was the only thing that stopped the number from being higher, which is perhaps the most honest way to end this. Not with resolution, not with justice feeling complete, but with the reminder of how thin the line was and how close it came to going so much further than it did. For more forgotten cases, strange mysteries, and dark history, consider subscribing, and until next time,